So, hello, Schizophreniforms, aka David Bradley, aka Dr. B. Continuing the video series, a two-part, of, as far as I've got, discussing and coming up with concepts for my treatment method that I've been using on myself to help me overcome the limitations of my mental illness, which, aka, namely, schizophrenia. And this section, I'm going to put a huge disclaimer verbally here now. Like, this worked for me. It worked for me. That's all I can say. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a psychologist. The only thing that I've ever done with which I have any qualification in is how to be schizophrenic. And I've got that down to a fucking T. So, the methodology that I've used, and I've called it Transverbal Synesthetic communication technique. So the basic premise is to integrate pre-verbal, non-verbal, subverbal and verbal communication into one whole process externalized from the individual. That's kind of important. And take all those forms of communication and turn them into a language form that could be considered akin, not this, but akin to mind-to-mind communication via the medium of both normal forms of communication and the meditative self-monitoring and controlled hallucinations. Now, the purpose of this isn't necessarily for normal, healthy people. It's more for people who experience hallucinations and they want to know how to navigate them better. They want a framework for addressing these issues, or how to manage them, and how to turn them into something positive, an ability rather than a disability, like bringing yourself up. And that's what I've been trying to do for years. So a lot of this is going to be spurious. Like a lot of this is just what I did. Like, it's not even necessarily particularly rational or scientific. It's just, I mean, there's pages and pages of it, so I'm just going to go through it. And if you don't like it, and this is the most important thing for me, if you know better, leave a comment, contact me, help me turn this into a therapy, a way to treat not only myself, but other people. Because in my life, I feel lost to a certain extent, because I found that Western medicine, Western analytical thinking can only go so far. Spirituality only provides certain answers. And I'm trying to fuse them, but I'm not equipped, I'm not qualified to do that. All I have is my own experience and how I've managed these things. So this is what I'm presenting now. So the basic method involves the following. Mentally projecting a thought into one's own subconscious by means of visualization, so symbols, mental images, focusing on certain words or phrases and repeating them as a mantra so as to deeply absorb them into the belief structure or subconscious mental framework of the individual, which, as I understand it, is the language of the subconscious. So visualization is how you can, and repetition of how you program stuff. Like, this is quite common in what I understand of neurolinguistic programming. When you're doing it, it's almost like a self-hypnosis technique. You visualize something so strongly. This is how ritual magic works as well. Like, you powerfully imagine something until it starts to reflect in your subconscious, and then your subconscious feeds that back to you. And this is how we reprogram hallucinations, basically. So it's projected, but the way it becomes a communication technique is it's projected out as what I put here is a fully non-verbal communication with a higher accuracy of portrayal of and through one's normally subconscious thought processes through body language, non-verbal communication, as well as seemingly spontaneous thoughts and ideas, channeling, which are then expressed via non-verbal and typically non-conscious dialogues. Now, again, not a scientist, not a psychologist. I know limited things in limited areas, not qualified to talk about any of this, but this is just what works for me. So, this is a way of conveying through these subconscious thought processes one's conscious intentions or thoughts, and then you can further discuss this and quantify it and verify it verbally. It doesn't exclude verbal speech. It's an integration of every form of communication from a distance, from the background, and using things like visualization to project out through these normally non-conscious means or subconscious means what you're trying to say. So like when you give someone a hug and you really mean it, you'll embrace them and they'll feel it not just physically, but there's an emotional sensation that arises that gives the illusion, and that's why I say it's akin to mind-to-mind communication, it gives an illusion that you're mutually experiencing the same experience. It's communion. And I'm trying to find a way to rationalize that and make it usable as a communication technique. Now, the reason this is important is because, in my experience, when I interact with other people that have had psychotic experiences, or when they're psychotic, or so on and so forth, these things occur naturally. And I've talked to them about it. I've had my own experiences of that. I've been able to share this experience and these not abilities, but this communicative technique with people that aren't mentally ill. It can be my theory or idea or concept is that we can use this to bridge the gap between mentally damaged people with themselves. So it's a way of communicating more effectively by including everything that they're experiencing and being honest, but also a way that people who, say, don't have these experiences can relate to that thing that naturally occurs between the schizophrenic type or the schizotypal thing. And I'm not saying everyone with schizophrenia or psychotic illnesses has this experience, but there's some of them do. Some of them do. And that, to me, is important. And it's definitely my own experience. So, to continue, please, if you're not with me, that's fine, but if you're interested in what's coming next, just watch the video out and leave a comment, especially if I'm wrong. Like I said earlier, that's what I need to know. I want to know ways that I could do this if what I'm saying is wrong. So help me out, if you want to. With this ability to project thoughts, which is kind of rational, because it makes sense that if you visualize love and strongly allow yourself to feel love, you'll give a more passionate hug. It's demonstrated through your subconscious processes. You feel the hug more. So, but that's a good thing to use as an example of how this works. With this ability to project thoughts, naturally one would desire to be able to receive thoughts as well. Now this is where it could be a bit spurious, but also this part can be a lot harder to achieve. And generally, in my own experience, it comes in the form of a certain use of emotional sensitivity, meditative self-monitoring, and controlled hallucinations. We can pick up on mental images, thoughts, and feelings returned from the subconscious in the form of heightened sense of empathy and self-monitoring of emotional responses. So, you watch what arises, like when you receive the hug. So you're giving the hug, you're feeling it there, but you're also receiving that emotional sensation back in your body. You're getting that, what's it called? The emotion, the thing that creates love. It's a tactile sensation, I can't remember what it's called, it's a chemical reaction, oxytocin. And it gives you a sensation that rises through your body, it rushes through your body. There's a feedback situation. You're not just giving something out and projecting it, you're receiving as well. That's how empathy works, mirror and so on. I talked about this in other videos. But reactionary emotions, intuition, gut feeling, unusual, seemingly intrusive or non-personal thoughts, as well as deliberate and controlled hallucinations of voices, auditory hallucinations, energy or seeing auras, visual hallucinations, and sensations arising in the body in conjunction with emotional responses, tactile. So I kind of covered that, and it's all kind of self-evident. Some people think that these things are delusions. Other people experience them so categorically that they find alternate explanations for them. But what I'm trying to do is find a common ground where these things become useful regardless of their validity or presence in tangible real reality. It's maybe a transient illusion, but it's useful, and learning to master that can be very restorative, and it has been in my own case. At least to a certain extent now. That's why I need your help, specifically you, whoever you are. That's why I need your help in refining this. So this can be achieved through practicing altered states of consciousness, meditation, and an innate or deliberately practiced sensitivity common to the collective empathetic, psychotic, some schizophrenics, and also quite common in people that frequently use hallucinogens or entheogenic drugs, or indeed anyone that feels anyone that feels something. Like, this can be cultivated in anyone, and it doesn't have to be a reaction for, it doesn't have to be a treatment for someone who's ill. It can be an enhancement of your perception of reality as well. Like, it's not exclusive to, it's not like I'm special because I can do this. Like, that's the key. So the original spiritually or religiously interpreted or otherwise potentially damaging hallucinations in the case of the schizophrenic or psychotic person can be subverted, but for example, through neurolinguistic programming, like I was talking about earlier. So through the subconscious feedback system, which we were just talking about, reprogramming yourself so that you can more accurately understand what you're experiencing, so through mindfulness and noticing and self-observation, but also what you're projecting until you've got a more, not truly objective, but a more objective view of your subjective experience. And training that process, training the feedback system by quantifying it verbally and writing it down and making notes and practicing experiments like I've kind of casually done for a number of years to get this to be more accurate. Like, purging insecurity is the next step. So getting rid of negative self-feedback. So learning, like, one of the things they treat you in depression, for example, is, or when you're being treated for depression with things like NLP or CBT, is that your own dialogue, your own self-talk, your own internal dialogue, quite commonly in people with depression, and I don't know whether this is across the board, but I definitely found it the case, was if you become to observe, if you have the self-awareness and reflectiveness and sensitivity to which you can train, it's not unique to me or anyone else, to observe your inner dialogue without influencing it, you'll find this, it's a constant stream of negativity or abuse or almost OCD repetitious thought process that is just telling you how you feel, what you've experienced. It's like a train dragging you down a certain mental and emotional path that as soon as you observe it, you go, why am I saying this to myself? I wouldn't do this to another person. I wouldn't treat my partner or my child or my father or my loved ones or friends with this kind of disdain and ignorance and abuse, but for some reason, because we're doing it to ourselves, that seems acceptable. So reprogramming that through things like NLP and CBT can be really useful in this sort of exercise, because they lead to unhealthy misinterpretations of information. And the way you can do this is cleansing exercises, whether that be a spiritual practice or a psychological practice with a therapist. You retrain the subconscious, you reprogram your own mind and to become more accurate, and in this case not just to stop damage, but to actually become a useful system, to become a feedback loop, to become a program that goes, I feel sad now. Not like with, for example, people who experience voice hearing, they might have something go, oh, you look like shit, fuck you, and that's like, I feel negative about my own self-image. I feel bad about myself. That's what that information is giving. And then there's various ways to deal with that and react to that. And like I was saying in the previous video, and I've emphasized this quite a lot, the more you resist a thought or a process, it becomes harsher, it becomes more powerful, it becomes more negative, it becomes more aggressive, because it's something that you want to acknowledge, but you're disowning it. And then to reintegrate that and accept it, even if it doesn't stop happening, at least you need to stop attacking that. You need to let the wall drop and just accept that it's a part of yourself in some way, even if it's externalized still or you can't cope with it. At least you're not resisting it, and thus it doesn't give it any power. And like, there's something called the photograph method that my father taught me about, actually, which is very interesting, which was initially when you have a memory of a traumatic experience, you see that it's like seeing an old photograph that conjures all these powerful vivid memories, and sometimes it doesn't, but in some people, if it's a traumatic experience especially, we learn to hold on to negative experiences because of it's an evolutionary benefit to do so. Like, if you've experienced violence, then you're going to be hypersensitive to, at some level, to that violence happening again, because it's raised the bar of your experience. Sort of going off topic a bit here, but the idea is that you hold on to trauma more than you hold on to joy. So bad or good, you're more likely to remember the bad, and it's because it's a survival technique. If like you get scratched by the bush, you go, all right, I won't go near the bush again. it trains you to survive, and it's perfectly natural, but it can create endless suffering because we react to these things unnecessarily. We get an emotional response to, say, someone giving us a dirty look as though we've been stabbed, or exaggerated things like that. So using these cleansing exercises, using this reprogramming of the subconscious materia that arise, and using self-affirmation, so building yourself up, giving yourself contradicting those voices, whether they be externalized voices or just your own internal dialogue, contradicting that part of you that thinks it's all right to abuse yourself, and that's another thing. And then there's something that I'll talk about later, which is called the Egoic Contract, which I'll come back to. So remember that term, Egoic Contract. I don't think I made it up, but it's something I've adapted from something I heard that I can't remember, it was years ago. So C, the content and context of the hallucinations through experimentation with these faculties in a safe environment, a calm and healing set and setting, and quantification verbally with the facilitator and or other participants. So what I'm talking about here is, even if you're not using psychedelics, like I was lost. I used psychedelics. If you've seen any of the videos, you'll know I've used psychedelics in some sort of attempt to heal myself. Now, if you induce the hallucinations, and that can just be as simple as like dropping your guard and letting the voices come if you're schizophrenic, or listening to your own internal dialogue and not resisting it and just hearing it. And a lot of these things will be practiced through meditation and with NLP and CBT alike. But allowing yourself to hallucinate or experience hallucinations without being traumatized by them, which is obviously going to be a lot easier for people that aren't suffering from traumatic hallucinations. And some people might need to use meditative or psychedelics or so on and so forth to have these insights and these hallucinations. I'm not recommending they do, but it's a possible avenue, and it worked to a certain extent to help me reframe my experience. I'm not suggesting it, I'm just saying this is an approach that some people might want to use, but that's not for me to say. But doing so and learning to hallucinate, like becoming a professional hallucinator. So you see this with like people with like long-term trippers, basically people that use psychedelics responsibly for their own betterment. They even, like Terence McKenna, I was going to use as an example, but he ended up so traumatized by the vividness of his experience that he was never able to re-access that because of a mushroom trip, or I think it was a mushroom trip or a DMT trip he had, but it took him too far. So there's always, and that is probably why my brain suggested me say this, there's always going to be a risk there with psychedelics, whereas with meditative practices, and even meditative practices, you can go to dark places sometimes. So just beware, there's a risk involved to have these positive things, but there's skills. You learn something useful from it. You learn to navigate a realm of the mind, an altered state of consciousness, whatever that may be. And that can be really useful if you can verify in this hallucinatory feedback process that someone else is experiencing the same thing as you. Even if it's not exactly the same, the closer you get, the more ability you have to commune over your experience, then that's kind of a sign of progression in my eyes. And yeah, so even just saying, like, I'm seeing this, or I'm feeling this, and the person going, oh, I feel that too, that kind of validates the experience. Like when you hug someone and they say, oh, I feel that, I really felt that, like, and the other person might not just say it out of empathy or desire to please you, but they might say, yeah, me too, actually, that was really, I feel a real bond. So it's called chemistry. It comes from oxytocin, and there's loads of biological reasons for it, and neurological reasons, and there is an evolutionary strategy that's developed these things. But why not use them consciously? Why not manipulate them, but at least be aware of them and stand at the back so you can observe the whole picture, which is what this whole thing's about. So you remember that thing, the Egoic Contract I was talking about earlier? Sorry, if this, by the way, I just realised I'm talking very fast and quite intensely, so if you want to stop, pause, go back, look at anything I've said. If you disagree, brilliant, let me know why, give me the evidence. If you agree, again, let me know why, what's your own experience, because I'm free-forming and I get caught up in my own ideas. So, but anyway, back to the point, the Egoic Contract. So for me, this is an essential part of the transverbal communication, and it involves, and especially on the receiving side, so not so much on the transmitting side and sending out information, but on the receiving information, It's an essential part because it involves a willful and conscious effort to do the following things. Induce controlled and practically applicable hallucinations. And that, it may not be necessary, but you don't have to do this approach either. And if that sounds scary, it's because it is scary. But you can learn to navigate it healthily. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. So induce controlled and practically applicable hallucinations. B. Engage a safety mechanism, the ego itself, like in the metaphysical term of the ego, which prevents psychical, like pertaining to the psyche rather than psychic, and also psychic overload and misinterpretation. And C, so the third part, facilitate easier movement into and out of altered states by avoiding internal egoic conflict. So an example of this might be when people have an episode of psychosis, or like a drug trip, or a bad trip. It's whether a lot of people say the best way to overcome that is to submit to the experience. Stop trying to resist it, stop it happening, but to just allow it to be, and then in this way it ceases to be painful, it ceases to be overwhelming, it ceases to be a bad trip. If you just face, yeah, I don't like this, but I accept it, I'm not going to try and stop it. Quite often people who take hallucinogens or have had psychosis, or like I was talking about earlier with NLP, where like you have a bad thought and you try and stop it, and then that bad thought gets worse whereas you just accept it, let it go. Like, there's a lot of this in mindfulness and meditation. That's why meditation is such a useful skill for this as well. And the idea is that entering an altered state of consciousness that involves ego dissolution. Now, whether you term the ego as an actual physical thing or just a mental construct that you develop, a lot of people think that it has substance, especially people in the spiritual community. And that's the way in which I'm using these words, like egoic dissolution. And that can be the sense of self, that can be your self-identification, but entering states where there appears to be no sense of self or no sense of personal identity, such as taking hallucinogens, deep meditation, or otherwise naturally occurring or deliberately induced even psychotic states, where you voluntarily allow yourself to become psychotic, to analyze the process. And I don't mean fully psychotic, like permanent, like damaging psychotic. I just mean like entering into a state of agitation as calmly as possible. So deliberately induced psychotic states. And that can even, I don't know, I'm not going to say that, but I was thinking in my own case, I've on occasion done that by having slightly less meds than necessary, just to give me a slight insight without putting any real risk to myself. Because I've taken hallucinogens to do it the other way, so. But that's just a risk I've taken with myself. I actually categorically would suggest not doing that. That's my disclaimer. Do not do that, because it has knock-on consequences, and the development of your medication, if you are schizophrenic, that it leaves a lull for a few days, and like you're better off keeping the meds and just doing mental practices and not fucking around with your brain too much. So yeah, I'm ranting a bit now. So the subject mentally sets up an imaginary contract or through the self-affirmation process with the ego, however you want to term that, but with a self-monitoring process which would be similar in content to the statement below, or at least in this format. And you might repeat this, you might use this, it might be like a mantra, it might be something you've done. But it's a mental process that you create to allow you to feel safe when you're hallucinating. I, the self, permit the ego to step in at any time that I am in danger of losing touch with objective reality. But unless this danger is apparent or necessary to be overcome, the ego will remain in a passive and, if possible, secondary and observational aspect of my mind. So akin to a tape recorder or a mental log of internal events and processes. So your desire to control events, your sense of identity, is allowed to gently slip away with the fact that you've said to it, if it needs to be there, it'll come back. And it's welcome back, and you encourage it and you allow it, and it's creating a dialogue between these seemingly disparate states and allowing it. Yeah, so that's just how I do it. And that's how I've learned to hallucinate without going mental, because I hallucinate all the time. Like, and if I try and resist that experience, the only thing that keeps me sane is just going, I'm just going to go with it, I'm just going to accept it, and then it calms. And it might take me hours to get to that state, but at least I'm able to do that, and that's really useful to me. So this, and I've just basically said what I'm about to say here. The internal contract, this internal contract between aspects of the psyche, or even imagined aspects of the psyche, facilitates greater recall of dreams, which I can verify from my own lucid dreaming practice, and hallucinations as well. And also, as well as a safety mechanism protecting both the ego, the personal sense of identity, and the self, the more fundamental sense of identity and perception of reality, from psychical damage, or even actual mental brain damage, or physical brain damage, sorry, and mental distortions. It can be written down and focused on, or used in the form of a mantra or self-affirmation until it's imbibed and accepted psychically. So until it's there, until it's become a construct, then do this practice. Then do this meditation work. Then do these controlled hallucinations. Once you've got that safeguard, that your brain or your mind is allowed to stop damage happening, but it's not the controlling force of that experience, and you're just there to observe. Yeah, it can be quite revelatory. It can be very good for treating OCD, I think, or like obsessive thoughts, or addressing anything where you can't accept your experience. Like, it can be useful. Obviously, it doesn't apply to every situation, but that I gather that's how they treat a lot of obsessive thoughts, is with things like meditation and mindfulness, where you just learn to accept. Okay, that thought that was previously pressing against you, just goes through. It's there. It rises. It'll fade. Simple as that. And this is just an extra safety mechanism to encourage that to be easier, and to give you a sense of safety, as well as that part of you that doesn't want to hallucinate and doesn't want to lose its self-identification, to feel safe as well, because it can always come back. So yeah, and the way I see it is like the effect of the egoic contract is akin to an off switch, or an intermediary stage of lucidity and rationality for transverbal communication and altered states, which ensures that when in an altered state or at that level of communication, one is calmer and feels safer. It also allows deeper forays into hallucination by creating a non-combatant attitude between the self and the ego. And I use this in the spiritual terms and the mystical terms rather than necessarily psychological terms, because I know that these terms, or recently had it pointed out to me that these terms are not necessarily used in modern psychology so succinctly, or at least not with such firmity as I'm using them. But yeah, it ensures there's a non-combatant attitude between the self and the ego, and because the egoic part of the participant is always able to step in or stop or reframe or grab hold of the experience, it feels much safer. That aspect of that tendency to grasp and go, like in lucid dreaming, where like you get excited because you suddenly become lucid and then you wake up and it's like, oh bugger, you shoot yourself in the foot. Whereas allowing that urge to grasp to subside makes it safer, and you're more able to go into the states more deeply, more frequently, and with less harm. It's like a harm reduction process. And I thought this was important because I'm encouraging people to hallucinate, basically, which is dangerous. So this is one of the ways I suggest that it's possible to reduce harm if you go to that level of inducing hallucination. It's possible to have these things without hallucinating, and I'll go into that later on perhaps, but if you want the hallucinatory hood like I have in myself, that I find very useful, this might be a safe way to acquire that. And it might be a short-term thing. You don't have to be permanently like that, like I am. And quite often I'm able to draw my focus elsewhere and I don't notice I'm hallucinating, but then as soon as I self-reflect, I'm like, oh yeah, no, I have been the whole time. And it's where you focus your mind as well. And this is a focusing tool. It's a skill to help you feel safe. Another aspect of this safety net is that one can artificially create safety mechanisms in the form of an alter, or an internal secondary egoic system. Bear with me, this might need some explanation. So these secondary systems are deliberately programmed to diffuse anxiety and encourage grounding through the internalization of a character of strength and rationality, such as a warrior or deity, or in some cases a copy or model of the behavior of an actual person who is grounded and rational. This might not work for everyone. It's just something that I've done. So, like, for example, if I'm tripping really hard and I go... So the one I use is Jinananda. It's from a meditation book that I read when I was 17. I've had it with me for my whole life. So it's a strong character to me. The idea of this bliss of the conqueror is roughly what it translates as. Or possibly, I think it's exactly what it translates as. But I say I am Jinananda. Not just I am, but like I'm not necessarily claiming to be God, but I'm claiming to be, which is a powerful influence for me as well, because I'm a religious person, for better or worse I am. But saying I am Jinananda, and it comes, and you can allow it to create mental connotations. Like when I'm tripping in these uncontrollable states, I draw on the sources of God, and that could be down through a mental image, imagining, or acceptance. It can be drawing, and I use these things not because I think they're necessarily real. I don't think I'm necessarily accessing bliss of the conqueror, the entity or the being that wrote the book or whatever, but because I'm accessing and allowing that state itself to permeate my consciousness, and I trained it in. And it might not be useful to you. It might even stand out as a bit fucking mental if you're watching this and you don't know me and I haven't had time to explain it any better than I am now. But yeah, it's just a potential, an alter ego that can be adopted in the tripping state so as to empower you, basically, and there's various ways to do that. So this can be done through ritual practices, such as Buddhist and pagan practices, of visualizing the self as deity, or channeling deity as a force of pure emotion. And you might need to look into more spiritual concepts for this. I'm not excluding anything, I'm not trying to be a scientist, like I'm not. If one thing should be evident to you by now, it's I'm not a scientist. But for typically self-transformative purposes, or in this case as a protective aspect of the self that, like the ego, can step in to halt dangerous or unpleasant experiences, or at least empower you until that experience subsides. And there's other connotations to that in spirituality, like people that visualize deity. There's certain people that believe that they actually slowly become closer and closer and closer and closer to deity by imagining their deity. If that sounds mental, it's not me saying that. That's something I've researched in spiritual books I've read, and I could list, but I can't be bothered because this is more important. But you can research that yourself. Like visualization as deity can be used for the transformative process of the ego to accept subsidence and things like this. These are their words and concepts, not mine. So this may evolve through time and become a friendly yet protective alter ego that can be adopted in times of anxiety or lofty misinterpretations, and it can also be used as a character which one consciously embodies and acts out through the form of psychodrama, which again not my term, whilst in the psychotic or altered state. This is definitely more for schizophrenic type people, but it can be useful for anyone. This can create a feeling of empowerment and mental strength, as I was saying, as well as certain abilities in the altered state which are given manifestation through belief of self as deity or whichever character is embodied. Examples of this are dream travel, like lucid dreaming, and psychical powers used by shamans to navigate the astral or spirit realms and battle spirits when they encounter on these internal journeys. So, like, if you've seen the other videos, I was saying I've seen a visual image in my mind as though there was a demon in the room with me, and I used light that I drew down from God to destroy it. It's like within the context of the hallucination, you use your imagination and the power of your belief to fight that hallucination and protect yourself. And this is a way of doing that. Like, you have to defeat the hallucination in context of the hallucination if it's really damaging or attacking. And that's why you use in spirituality, as far as I can tell, that's why you use metaphor to describe, or metaphysics. I'm going to retract that last statement, but you use metaphor and allegory to explain spiritual principles. Because it's the only way it puts you in a certain state of mind. So, like, if I'm tripping really hard from just my natural psychotic state that I sometimes enter into, it might be really unpleasant. And the only way to overcome that is not only is there subsidence to it, but there's also defense. You can psychically, mentally defend yourself against these things. So, right, that's about as far as I can manage to say just now. So I'm going to come back and make this a 2-part in one video. So I'll be right back.